Zimbabwe is holding elections for yet another 5 years of dictatorship to some, of course, and democracy, depending on which side you're on. But in this video, I will explain why Nelson Chamisa, who is the 46 or 45-year-old presidential candidate, might have a chance of winning this election. And he is going against Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is the incumbent, or who is the leader of the country at the moment. But then the biggest question that everyone has is, why are Zim elections or Zimbabwean elections always complicated? Well, here is where it all started. How many of us ever wonder why most military governments in Africa are celebrated as heroes of the freedom of the people, and then we have Zim, which is a military state that is loathed by its people and they want it out? So you see, I'm going to break it down for you, but you should be patient to watch this to the end, because I'm going to bring in where Nelson Chamisa comes in. Now hold on. All this trouble of disputed elections and also having this kind of setup started with the man called Peter Wars, a top general in the Rhodesian army. And anyway, before we start with Peter Wars, we have to go back to 1980. So after a successful state ceremony that was even graced by King Charles III and Bob Marley, Mugabe had one mandate, which was to make sure that the white people and the black people are united and secure in the newly formed country. So the new Lancaster Constitution then, by that time, was established with executive president as the head of state and then the prime minister as the head of government. These are the difference, and take note, which saw the Reverend Kenan Banana as the president, and Mugabe did not see this happening for a long time since he was the prime minister. And by the way, we said the executive president was the head of state and the prime minister was the head of government. Take note of that. Zimbabwe had sort of a bicameral system, which is a parliament that has the House of Assembly and indirectly elected Senate. And it had separate voters' roll, which were established. One was for the black majority, which had 80% of seats, and another for the ethnic minorities, 20% of the seats. That's where the white people were constituted. So seeing that black people and the white people had separate voters' roll, Mugabe still didn't feel powerful enough, and he realized that as long as the army had the run of the former Rhodesian general Peter Wars, he has no absolute power. So he kept Peter Wars as the head of army. Stay with me. He kept Peter Wars as the head of the army, but then he introduced a plan which was to integrate the armed functions or the armed forces, the different militias that were in Zimbabwe back then. So we had a militia called the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, which was called ZIPRA, and we had the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army called ZANLA. And we also had the former Rhodesian Army, which was also another form of army, if you get where I'm going. So with all these changes, Mugabe wanted it to be integrated into one, which was called the Zimbabwe National Army. With all these changes, he kept the white minority in control of the integrated military units. And then the Western media, because they saw one black man who was leading the general of an army being white, even though it was a newly independent country called Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. Therefore, they were very, very proud of Mugabe. And at some point, Mugabe was even knighted by the Queen of England. Just imagine, he was a darling. But then, like they say, tensions are meant to be. However, suddenly on the 27th, it was on the 17th of March 1980, after several assassination attempts, on which 7 of those attempts, he was served by the current president. Remember? Then Mugabe asked Wars, that was on the 17th of March 1980. He asked Wars to say, "Why are your men trying to kill me?" So Wars then replied and said, "If they were my men, you would be dead." This man, I liked him. So That's where the problems started in Zimbabwe's history. And no one is going to tell you this, because this is where all the problems we had since 1980 started. So Zimbabwe has a vicissitudes and a multitude of problems, of course, the economic problems, but they all started with these two men. But let me get on to it.
The bulk of the former security forces were black. I enjoyed serving with and in command of those chaps, black, white and coloured and Indian. I have never felt that I represent, or that the forces represent, any one segment of the population. I don't think my retirement has any effect whatsoever on white people. I think that security forces, the new National Army, composed of the former security forces and ZAN and ZIPRA, merging into this army very successfully, they provide a bulwark against any kind of threat, and there isn't any threat to this country from outside at the present time anyway.
So on 11 August 1980, during an interview, Wars told the BBC that he had asked Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister of the UK, to nullify the 1980 election prior to the official announcement of the results, on the grounds that Mugabe had used intimidation. And this was when Mugabe realized that the problem is having an army that is powerful and with a voice. Do you get where I'm really going? So seeing these problems with dealing with the army, Mugabe had one mission: to keep the army separated from the executive branch. So he consolidated all the power by doing this. So the first thing that he did, Mugabe, in 1986, the government eliminated the voters' rolls and replaced the white seats with nominated or appointees, or appointed members, you can say. So many white MPs joined ZANU, but they still were reappointed to non-significant roles. So it's like he was bringing in white people into ZANU-PF, which was the party then. And then he would say, okay, fine, you get into the party, but then what you need to do is to not stay at a very influential position. So he gave them non-significant roles. He was putting them into, non-significant roles without any much political power. Why? Mugabe was doing mind games with people, consolidating the power to himself, to become one man, no distribution of power. Power lies into one man, because Mugabe did not feel safe with the ambitious white minority. Therefore, he amended the constitution again in 1987. And then he was now removing the post of the prime minister. Therefore, he became the president. That's where things started. So the government abolished the Senate again. 1990, the House of Assembly membership was expanded, including the nominated people. You remember, the nominated people, he would nominate. So he had powers that were put around him to bring in changes within the arms of the government. Hence the courts, hence the arms of the government, hence all the necessary elements of government were put in Mugabe's palm. He had control over these things. But with all these changes Mugabe eliminated, he wanted to eliminate all those who have potential, or those who ever want to get closer to him. Therefore, in the early days, he dealt with the likes of Josiah Tongogara, Bodagezi, who had created a paramilitary army of the youth called Bodagezi. But then, who do you think knew all this, and who kept these top secrets of Robert? Now, just ask yourself a question there. Who kept the secrets of Robert, who had the portfolio right here? I know you know. Yes, you know him. His right-hand man, who also was a former military man, who always been working as a shield against all military threats and attacks. And he belonged to a revolutionary militia named the Gare Unit. Hence they called him the Crocodile. And he led, later on, they were calling him Lacoste. He was a top secret operative with, he represented the army from within the corridors of power. This was Emmerson Mnangagwa, the current president of Zimbabwe. Now, Mugabe did not entrust him with executive powers. Mind you, he did not see Mnangagwa as a person to trust with power, because he said he was brutal and he had military tendencies and he had a bit of a belligerent way of dealing with matters. But then let's do away with the history. Let's get to now why this election, this particular election, is important. So fast forward to 2016, the wife of Mugabe, Grace Mugabe, was attacking the current president and calling him all sort of names. And his Lacoste cabal. And there were two cabals that were fighting, or they call them factions, right? There was the Lacoste faction and there was the G40, which was called Generation 40, of generation of 40-year-olds who were trying to lead the country into the next generation because they felt like they were young. But Mugabe, in all this, he didn't see that he was about to fall to his knees by the sword he carved from his own hands. However, now we see Nelson Chamisa heading toward the presidency. And is he going to be allowed by the army? Well, some sources have suggested that he was offered a deal, because even now the army is divided, because we have the military that still wants the best out of the country and we have the military that still wants to protect its privileges. But the biggest problem that the country is facing is that clearly Zimbabwe is a military state. It's a junta. But the idea of military that has been put in Zimbabwe is that they wanted to keep control of the people. Because remember, Mugabe, from how I initially introduced what Mugabe was doing to consolidate power into the executive. Power is meant to be shared in governance for it to be a democratic process and a democratic society. Power has to be shared. And how is it shared? We have the three arms of the government. We have the judiciary, we have the president or the executive, and we have the legislator. But then what happened to Mugabe? Mugabe came in. He is the one who nominates the top judges. He is the one who nominates the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which is supposed to be the independent board that deals with the election and transition of power in Zimbabwe. Hence, all the power and all the might that a leader has is centralized upon one person. And that person has the power to decide who decides the outcome of the election. And since the person who gave you the job to make changes of an outcome of an election is the same person who can fire you if he makes it to the next term. Hence, you see, most of these people who are commissioners of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, or the one that runs the elections, are always in the pockets of ZANU-PF, which is the party that is led by the government. But here comes Nelson Chamisa. Nelson Chamisa is the hope of the people. He stands as the pathway to what people see as a democratic transformation of a country. But then, how far does he have influence within the army ranks? Because clearly the country is besieged by a force to reckon with, which is the army. And like they say, we have two men, General Constantino Chiwenga, who transformed from being a military general into becoming a vice president, who is also the Minister of Health. So much power they need. Already you can tell and you can sense the tension between Chiwenga and ED. And as they are together, you can realize that someone also wants a piece of presidency. The real question is, how far does Chiwenga see Mnangagwa controlling the country if he doesn't connive or he doesn't conspire against Mnangagwa with the new boy? And definitely that presidency is going to be a very tricky one for Chamisa, because he's going to be controlled by the army again. So it's no secret, ladies and gentlemen, that Zimbabwe is on a crossroad of a path to a better future with the young Nelson Chamisa, and everyone in the country is actually hoping that Nelson Chamisa wins. But then the elections have always been marred by violence and an unleveled ground. Till next time, please don't forget to subscribe and like this video and make a comment as well if you have any suggestions. Thank you.